exactly, or RE plus storage is the cheapest option. Forget air pollution, forget carbon, forget retiring coal plants. I just see so many brilliant innovators in India building things on $1 million or $2 million, what folks in the US and Europe have done with $100 million or $200 million.
Coal-fired power or renewables, especially solar power, which saves you more money? Today, we are looking at why old energy habits could be costing you money and how renewable energy, especially solar, has become the ultimate market winner. So first, the good news: in India, renewable energy, notably solar and wind, is now consistently cheaper than polluting coal-fired power. But is India still missing a key move? Should it be going all out on renewables over coal to ensure a win-win for the consumer, the country, and the planet? Somebody who studied this a lot firsthand is Alexander Hogaveen Rutter, an independent energy expert who joins me on this Earth Chakra podcast. One of his main findings is this: that forget about climate action if you want, but look at the market case for renewables. It's cheaper for consumers. It will mean more jobs. New renewable energy is more cost effective than coal, and it saves precious foreign exchange. So Alex, thanks for joining me. And we just have to talk about what happened in Texas. But if I may begin by asking, on average, what is the price advantage from a consumer's point of view between renewables and coal? What reforms or changes are needed at the distribution company level? Because, I mean, that's where we get our bills from. Our DISCOM bills come from there.
Yeah. So it's a little confusing because there's, you have to look at the true cost of renewables, right? So obviously solar is infirm. So solar from the utility scale perspective is 2.5 rupees per kilowatt hour. But the actual differential between RE plus storage and coal is more like about 2 rupees. So if you have firmed up renewables, so you added storage, you've added transmission, you include kind of the all-in price of renewables, it might be more like, let's say, 4.5, 5 rupees. Similarly for coal, so you'll often see these numbers quoted like 6, 6.5, but that's just what I call the subsidized coal class. That's not including the cost of making that coal load following, which is more expensive than running as base load. And of course, coal has transmission as well, right? So if you include coal transmission and making it load following, it's more like 7, 7.5, 8 rupees. So the differential on an apples to apples basis, so firm, reliable power is about 2.5 rupees.
What do you mean by firm, reliable power?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. It sounds like an easy question, but it's not. When I first came to India and I noticed people have stabilizers, right? And a lot of people in India don't realize that's just an India thing. You don't see those in developed countries. And the reason you have stabilizers is because the frequency fluctuates. And the reason the frequency fluctuates is because coal can't ramp up and down, fast enough to meet the load fluctuations. And just to be clear, Grid India does a fantastic job managing the system. But where I come from, where we have market-based systems, I used to work for a hydro-based utility. We actually were compensated by our neighboring utility through the market base. So the coal plant would run at base load. And so at night, when the power was less valuable, they would effectively pay us to take their coal. And then we would sell it back to them during peak hours when it was more valuable. Similarly, we made money in the ancillary services market. Now, neither of those exist in India. I mean, the primary ancillary services market doesn't exist. There is a market, but it's optional. And most plants, 95% of power almost is exempt from the market. So effectively you have coal, which is not providing firm, reliable power, which is why you have stabilizers, which is why you have diesel gensets. Again, people in India just take diesel. If you're a wealthy Indian, you have a diesel genset. If you're a business in India, you have a diesel genset. Abroad, that's not common, right? Diesel gensets are for hospitals and prisons. That's it. And so this unreliability of coal is being subsidized by hydro, by gas, and by diesel gensets, and ultimately by load shedding, right? So what is reliable power? So there's different metrics. You can use availability. I prefer ELCC as a good metric, but the point is there's a lot of nuance to this question. To compare apples to apples, you have to say what is the same reliability of coal versus the same reliability of wind plus solar plus storage. And for that, it's about a 2.5 rupee. But there's a lot of nuance to it. It depends on the state, depends on the wind, depends on whether you allow for interstate trading and banking and things. There's a lot of nuance, but as a first approximation, firm reliable power is about a 2.5 rupee gap between wind, solar, storage, and coal.
So can we just look at where India's power landscape is headed? Because there are a lot of subsidies and promises, especially during election time, for free power or subsidized power. And So the high cost of power is obviously a political concern, but does India's energy policy prioritize affordability for consumers?
Yeah, so there's a very indirect relationship between the cost of power to the DISCOM and the cost of power to the consumers, right? So India, you have cross subsidy. So industry pays more than their fair share. Residential consumers and in particular agriculture consumers tend to pay less than their fair share. And so I try and stay away because that's more of a political, distribution, equality question, which I think is more of a values question than a technical question. What I like to focus on is are the DISCOMs getting the cheapest power possible, right? So what I and others experts in the field will call kind of least cost resource adequacy planning. And so, what happens if the DISCOM and Assam would be a great example here. Assam's buying a new power from a new coal plant that's 8.5 rupees per kilowatt hour rather than RE plus storage for 4.5. Now, the state government might say, well, we're going to step in, and you've had 5 distribution bailouts in the past 20 years, which they call distribution bailouts, but in some sense they're coal bailouts, because ultimately if you're buying power at higher than the cost you're selling it, you can blame the consumers for being too poor to afford it, or you can blame the DISCOMs for saying, why are you buying this expensive imported unaffordable power rather than the cheapest available, right? So it comes out of the DISCOMs. Either it comes in the form of bills, it comes in the form of DISCOM debts, which ultimately get bailed out, often by the central government. It comes in the form of state government finances, where the state government will cross-subsidize it. But, whatever pocket it's coming from, it's ultimately coming from the ratepayer or the taxpayer, right? So to me, and this is very standard practice abroad, where the DISCOM has an obligation to try and minimize the cost of power procurement. And that obligation is kind of there in the Electricity Act 2003 and was reinforced by a Supreme Court Act in 2025 last year, where they basically said the regulator should consider consumer interest. But traditionally they haven't. They've looked at procedural fairness, as in if Assam has a tender for a coal plant and you have 3 bidders and one bids 8 and one bids 7.5 and one bids 7, well, there's procedural fairness. The coal plant that's 7 was cheaper than the other 2, therefore was a fair regulatory process. What hasn't happened is the DISCOM taking a step back and say, what is the cheapest, most affordable power for my consumer? This coal plant at 7 or RE plus storage at 4. RE plus storage, they'll do the same thing. They'll say, okay, I've got a bidder at 5, I've got a bidder at 4.8, I've got a bidder at 4.5. I have to take, so there's procedural fairness within RE plus storage, and there's procedural fairness within coal, but you don't have the DISCOMs taking a holistic view and saying, how do I minimize my portfolio of my basket of generation to minimize my overall cost to my consumers, including transmission, including balancing cost, including distribution costs, all these other things.
Looking at how renewable energy is cost effective, at the moment, India is making rapid and really welcome progress on renewables, but it is also at the same time doubling down on coal-fired power, right? For new plants, there are plans to increase thermal power plant capacity by, I think, about 46% over the next 5-6 years. And we've also seen a huge increase of over 1,600% in funds allocated for coal development in the recent budget. Does this make sense given that solar power is unreliable? It's only there when the sun is shining. And how can there be a market case for renewables, especially for solar and wind, over coal?
Yeah, okay. So
in the present circumstances?
So there's 2 things. One is I really question this narrative that India's done rapid renewables. So when you look at a climate lens, India had these climate targets as far back as 2012, this national solar mission. When solar and wind was more expensive, there was an argument that, well, India's a developing country. We should do more than our fair share. We should prioritize development over the environment. And I think that's a valid argument, right? What's changed in the last 5 to 10 years is that the economics have completely switched. So the economics have switched, but we're still setting the RE targets with the climate lens rather than with economic lens, right? And so I and others have done analysis that says, this 500 gigawatt target, which was made back in 2017, 2018, when RE was perceived as expensive and when storage wasn't readily available to balance it, maybe it was ambitious. Maybe it was a rapid target at the time. But now that it's cheaper, your target, you should actually be meeting all the new demand growth, right? So India's been building 15, 20, 30 gigawatts of wind and solar per year. It actually, given the size of India's population, the size of India's GDP, the demand growth, it needs to be building at least 60, 70 gigawatts per year just to meet demand growth. So forget air pollution, forget carbon, forget retiring coal plants, just to meet the firm requirements of a growing population. India should be targeting at least 60 to 70 gigawatts. If you now say, okay, I actually want to retire these expensive imported coal plants, if I actually want to do something about energy security, I've calculated it should be targeting more like 130 a year. But if you want to do green hydrogen, for example, it needs to be targeting much, much, much. So 3 to 4 times as much renewables as is currently being installed, purely from an economic lens. Now, what's changed in the last 5 years in particular is storage, right? So solar has been cheaper than coal since 2016, 2017. Wind has been cheaper than coal since 2016, 2017. But because they're infirm, because they're unreliable, you needed something to back it up. Now, what's changed in the last 5 years is, and I was writing about this back in 2018, 2019, saying you could back it up with storage. And at that time, the cost of storage was such that, well, wind and solar is cheaper, but storage is more expensive. So it's kind of a wash. But in the last 5 years, it's completely changed. So nowadays, new 6-hour storage is something like 75 lakh per megawatt per megawatt year rather. Whereas new coal is 225 lakhs per megawatt year. So it's about 3 times the cost of coal versus storage. So the energy is cheaper. So that's the wind and solar is the energy. That's comparable to like the cost of the coal, like the lump of coal, the energy. That's been true for 10 years. In the last 3 to 4 years, what we call capacity, so that ability to firmly meet, to balance the renewables, to balance the supply and demand, to kind of that real time meeting of, you turn on your lights, you expect that power to come on, even if it's the middle of the night. That's where storage comes in. And that's what the capacity value, which is different than the energy value. Capacity value is now cheaper as well than coal. And that's really what's changed in the last 3 to 4 years.
But simplify this a bit further. What has changed is we moved from a climate case for renewables, say about 10 years ago, to an economic case for renewables because it's just become a lot more affordable. And while India had a very ambitious 500 gigawatt goal of renewables by, I think, 2030, it was then, your argument is that ambition should now be ramped up to
it should be
whatever it is,
revised based on
700 or
economics. And
1,000.
I'll give you a very simple example. So I mentioned that you have these tenders for coal and you have to pick the cheapest coal plant. You have these tenders for RE, you pick the cheapest RE, right? But you don't compare the two. Well, 10 years ago, that made sense, right? Because that was protecting the RE. The coal was 5 rupees and the RE was 12. And so you said, well, we don't want the RE to compete against coal because we want to do RE for climate reasons, right? So I'm not blaming the why that was set up. It was set up for a good reason to try and promote RE. You had these separate tenders. But now that RE is cheaper, you're still building these new coal plants without doing any sort of economic analysis to compare them to the cost of RE plus storage. And we see this in Assam, we see this in Bihar, we see this in Pradesh, we see this in Madhya Pradesh, we see this in Rajasthan, where these new coal plants, well, Rajasthan, it's an ongoing case right now, but in general, you see these new coal plants getting approved without any sort of economic evaluation against the alternatives. They're only saying, is this the cheapest of the tender, rather than saying, is this the cheapest option for consumers?
That bit a bit more simply in going ahead, all these new plants that are being proposed or either in the pipeline, how are those going to be more expensive already than renewables?
Yeah, so just to be clear, none of them economic. So even the tenders quoted are 6.1, 6.5 rupees per kilowatt hour, whereas we know RE plus storage is about 4.5. Even if you add transmission, again, people say, oh, we have to add transmission. Well, you have to add transmission for the coal as well. But even if you add the transmission, it's still a substantial. Now, the other thing is 2 things. One is if you look at the past 10 years, coal plants tend to come in 20% over budget. So if they quote 6.1, actually get built, it's more like. The second thing is that's a base load price. That assumes the coal plant runs as a fixed base load, which 20 years ago, when India was perpetually power deficit, you didn't have to load follow. You just ran your coal plants straight and flat. And to the extent that load was higher, then just load shed, right? And that's why we have this legacy of diesel gensets in it. If your coal plant is actually expected to be load following, so PLF is 85% is base load, PLF of 60% would be load following.
Plant load factor, how much the plant is being used.
But effectively, if that coal plant has to, the evening when you come home and you turn on your air conditioning, the coal plant has to ramp up. In the middle of the night, when you go to bed and all the lights are off and the factories are closed and the subway's off, the coal plant has to ramp down. Again, completely ignoring renewables. That's a cost, right? So A, your fixed cost is spread against a smaller number of units. So that adds about half a rupee to a rupee. And then B, the coal plant runs less efficiently, at night or when there's surplus or during the day when there's solar. And so you have to add in that extra flexing cost to coal. So this 6.1 quoted is more like 7 as built, and it's probably more like 8 or 9 when you add in the flexing cost. Now, this is true for RE plus storage, right? The solar, the 2.5 is a fake number, right? You have to add in the cost of transmission, you have to add in the cost of storage, you have to add in the cost of balancing. And these are real costs. But that's how you get to that 4.5 or 5. It's still much cheaper than the new coal. But that true cost, that all-in cost, if you will, that's what's not being compared right now.
Another angle of that renewable energy saves foreign exchange. You had shared an example of how India had spent $85 billion over 4 years, I think, importing non-coking coal. Now, using that as an example, this would seem like a most pressing argument or win in today's economy, that investing in renewables actually saves foreign exchange. How can that play out, or how should that be factored into policy making over the next 2-3 years?
Yeah, I sometimes hear like, oh, well, we don't want to replace coal with, lithium or silicon, right? We're just going to import. But I think what people often forget is, if I import a lump of coal and then I burn it and then it's gone, right? Whereas you import solar and then it stays there for the next 25 years. And you can actually recycle it. You can actually get 90 to 95% recovery rates for both solar panels and batteries, right? So in some sense, once it's imported, it's there forever, right? And I think that's where there seems to be a disconnect when people talk about energy security. Oh, we don't know what imports. And so that's why, like, if I import, a crore worth of coal, it can produce, I think, 1 gigawatt hour. If I produce a crore worth of solar and batteries, it can produce 16 or 20. Like it's 16 to 20 times as much energy per dollar or per crore of imports, right? Now, there's some caveats here. So, for example, you might want to create jobs in manufacturing. Now, there's very little jobs in the upstream manufacturing, in the wafers, ingots, cells. There's a plant in China that does 50 gigawatts, so more than India's entire demand, and it employs 500 people. So it's literally a trivial number of jobs in the upstream manufacturing. The module manufacturing, and this is where India does have some capabilities, that can be done domestically. That actually does create jobs because that's more of kind of a manualist. But yeah, the absolute amount of 4x, it's if you took if you'd spent that $85 billion on that you spent on imported coal in the last 4 years, India could have instead spent that on importing batteries and solar. It could have built something like 700 or 800 gigawatts of solar. It actually did 150. So you literally could have built 5 times as much solar as India did if they prioritized importing solar instead of importing coal. And one last caveat in the energy security. There is the inverters. There's the smart. So there's an energy security angle about cyber attacks and cyber intelligence. So I just to be clear, I'm not advocating the BMSs or the inverters be important, because there's actually intelligence there that from a cybersecurity angle that it makes sense to have that being domestically made. But I'm talking about the cells, like the raw commodity, the dumb cells that there's no security risk there. Once that's imported, there could be Armageddon, and that would still continue to generate 25 years.
To all this is, of course, that which you mentioned earlier, is the batteries. Now, batteries are becoming more reliable. What is the hurdle in adopting more batteries or in setting up more battery storage in India at the moment? For instance, staying with that other example of $85 billion, that you would have bought solar equipment, but also battery storage equipment.
So, the biggest one is just markets, right? So you mentioned in the intro about Texas and ERCOT. So, Texas has installed something like 12 gigawatts of batteries. So one state, which has a power system a sixth the size of India's, has installed about 20 times as much batteries as India. So, and there's no climate, there's no yojana, there's no program, there's no incentives, there's no subsidies. It's purely because they have a market system. So as I said, India doesn't have a market system. There is an optional market, which about 6 to 7% of power gets traded in. But there's no market mechanism for saying, I'm going to allow you to trade at the actual price of power. So DISCOM will go and they'll say, I will need emergency peaking power. I will pay 18 rupees or 20 rupees, and they'll do what's called a bilateral contract. They'll contract directly with gas generators to provide that peaking power at 18, 20 rupees. There's no open tender. There's no, I can get that from storage. Actually, it was the first tender, open tender that NTPC literally just launched like yesterday. but it's only for 1 year, whereas batteries tend to need at least a 5-year contract to kind of get the debt financing from a bank. But that just kind of a little glimmer of hope where at least there was a technology neutral tender. India's first technology neutral tender was literally this week. Very, very circumscribed, very, very small. But I hope to see more.
I want to talk about how renewable energy creates more jobs. But before that, could you simplify what exactly happened in Texas over the last, what's been reported
It's very simple.
recently?
They have a market-based system. And so basically what happens is the equivalent of the DISCOMs have to pay for the true cost of power. So in India, what happens is the market price is capped at 10. So when the price goes above 10, so imported coal and imported gas, either they make a bilateral contract with the gas plant or they load shed, which, you have a diesel plant that costs you 25, 30 rupees per kilowatt hour, right? Rather than saying, I'm going to contract with a battery plant at, let's say, 15 rupees per kilowatt hour, they have these bilateral deals with these gas plants. And then again, this again gets back to having an open market, having least cost resource planning, having technology neutral auctions. There's different ways to approach it. Texas just has an entirely free market. Some other markets like PJM, for example, which in northeastern US, they have capacity markets, which basically explicitly pay for that firmness and firm reliability. You have California, where they just mandated and said, go build storage. You've seen that in China as well. As opposed to Europe, where it's been more market-based. So there's lots of different approaches. But the point is, India's kind of somewhat unique in that they have this kind of two-track system where we expect RE plus storage to compete, but we say to coal, we're just going to give you this fixed amount. We're going to give you this firm ROE. We're going to do this tender that's just for coal. That I don't think people in India, because it's just the legacy of where things happened. In 2003, when the Electricity Act was passed, they kind of grandfathered in and said, we can continue to have these coal tenders to India short power. And so we just kind of continued to have these coal specific tenders. And yeah, as I said, as soon as battery storage gets allowed to compete on a apples to apples direct basis with coal, we'll see battery storage take off in India. And one final caveat, we do see it taking off to a certain extent. You do have some storage specific tenders. So again, we don't see storage competing against coal, but we do see storage specific tenders. So a lot of those should come up in the next 2 to 3 years. One of the challenges there was that they put in a 24-month timeline, again, because wind takes 24 months. So they just copy pasted the tender design. Battery can be built in 3 months. You could have a tender that says build this in 3 to 6 months. But yeah, we will see some of these storage tenders come online in the next 2 to 3 years. It's just there's this delay because it's tendered rather than, but that delay is built into the tender. It's not a function of the physics of batteries or the lead times. It's just what they built.
So while India is building its capacity for making a battery storage, it would make sense, at least in the short run, to just import this rather than build new coal capacity.
Absolutely. And again, a new coal plant takes 5 to 6 years, right? So if your concern is power outages today, if your concern is energy reliability and affordability today, you could start building the battery storage today and have firm reliable power. As I said, if this amount you spent in imported coal in the last 4 years, if they did spend, they could have built 700 gigawatts of solar, right? So you could have completely eliminated power outages in India. And then, yes, use those next 3 to 4 or 5 years. If you drive down the cost of power, that makes your manufacturing more competitive. It makes shoe manufacturing more competitive. It makes bolt manufacturing more competitive, but it also makes solar and battery manufacturing more competitive, right? One of the reasons solar and battery manufacturing is uncompetitive in India is because of the high cost of industrial power. So there's this circular logic. Because you have these coal plants, you drive up the cost of power. Because the cost of power is higher, it makes your solar and battery manufacturers uncompetitive. Because the solar and battery manufacturers are competitive, you end up having to import. And because you're importing, you say, well, I don't want to import. I just want to build coal, right? You need to break that chain. You need to start by saying, let's have lower power, pass on those savings to the industrial commercial consumers, and that will help make the manufacturing more competitive.
A related aspect is that the jobs that renewable energy has the potential to create. Now, the data you show is that this will not affect the existing 200,000 or 250,000 people in roughly working in this coal sector. So at one end, you have the innovators and startups, but where would the bulk of green jobs be, and how many more jobs are we talking about?
Yeah, so I always like to put it in jobs per gigawatt hour, jobs per terawatt hour, right? Because coal has, just to be clear, there are more jobs in coal than RE in India today, but that's because India gets 73% of its power from coal versus just 12% from wind and solar, right? So you have 6 times as much power from coal, so you have more jobs in coal. And when I say the existing 250,000 jobs, 2.5 lakh jobs in coal wouldn't be touched, that's because I'm saying if India starts building 60, 70 gigawatts of RE, that will just meet the demand growth. So the existing coal will still be required, just to be clear. If India were to start saying, let's build 100, 150 gigawatts of RE, then you would start to retire coal. Then you would start to impact the coal job. But yeah, where are the jobs? So two things. They're in the module manufacturing. And this is an important distinction. India has plenty of module manufacturing in solar and battery manufacturing, pack manufacturing in batteries. The cells, as I said, there's very, very few jobs in cells. And so it's negligible. Like if you look at a chart of the jobs in RE, it's upstream manufacturing, module manufacturing, but the vast bulk is in construction. Particularly distributed solar, rooftop solar tends to be much more expensive. It's much more labor intensive. People driving around in trucks, climbing up on people's roofs. So there tends to be a lot more jobs in distributed solar. And this is one of the reasons it's more expensive, right? There's, in India, there's been kind of this, again, L1 mentality where if utility scale solar is 2.5 and distributed solar is 3.5, why should we pay for distributed solar? I mean, there's two reasons. One is it's better for grid stability to have it distributed. Two is you're saving the transmission and distribution costs. So that 3.5, the true cost of that 3.5 is actually comparable to the true cost of the 2.5 for that utility scale. And third is, it creates a lot more jobs. Even the utility scale solar and utility scale wind, the construction, and then in the O&M. So there's a bit of maintenance, like cleaning it and maintaining and spares and that sort of thing. And a lot of people say, well, these are one-time jobs, but this is my point. If you start building 60, 70, 80 gigawatts of RE per year, again, to displace coal, you need to start building, let's say 100 gigawatts of RE per year, 120 gigawatts of RE per year. So that'll create tons and tons of jobs in construction. And it will take 20 years at that pace to actually displace the existing coal plant. Well, 20 years from now, you'll need to replace the solar wind plant. So there'll actually be, these construction jobs are not temporary. They really are permanent if you start to move to wind and solar and storage, because you have that demand growth and eventually you will need to replace these. And it will take 20 to 25 years to actually, again, not at the current rate of 30 gigawatts per year. It will take 20, 25 years of 100 gigawatts of RE per year to actually displace the coal plants. And so it's 100 gigawatts a year of construction jobs forever in wind and solar. And that's not even talking about the jobs in manufacturing, not even talking about the jobs in operations and maintenance, just the jobs in construction.
Because of the rooftop solar project that the government has, a lot of people interact with solar power at that level, at a very personal level, when they put solar panels on the rooftop. Where does that fit into this entire thing of driving costs lower at a large level?
There's a trade-off, right? Because it's as I said, it's great for jobs. It's great for getting local buy-in. It's great for enhancing the benefits to communities. A lot of that's really hard to measure, right? Like a lot of these will be informal jobs, right? These might be very small companies. It might be a father and his son installing solar, and so they may not even pay taxes. They might be very, very small. They might be barely registered, right? And so the benefits are there, but they're very distributed. And so it's the problem. If I have one big coal plant that employs 500 people versus thousands and thousands of SMEs employing thousands of people, it creates more jobs per gigawatt hour, but there's not like a natural constituency. There's not like that coal plant, you have a big company that employs hundreds of thousands of people that says, I want to build a new coal plant and I will employ 1,000 people in your state. Whereas if they instead build distributed solar, and actually even distributed wind, there's micro wind as well, it will create thousands of jobs distributed throughout the state. So that you won't necessarily get the same electoral impact. You won't necessarily get the same headline as you would if it's distributed. In terms of cost, it's a bit of a trade-off. So you look at, for example, Australia's gone very big on rooftop solar. US has gone a bit more big on utility scale. China's done both. I personally think there's a role for both, especially in places like UP, Bihar, Chhattisgarh, where you're very population dense. You don't necessarily have large land blocks for utility scale solar, and that's where the rooftop or distributed makes more sense. Agri-PV is something that doesn't get nearly enough attention. You can put solar panels above, and then you have certain crops need less sunlight. It's like mushrooms, lemongrass, let's say, peppers, or you can graze goats underneath or graze cows underneath. But the point is, distributed solar is going to cost more than utility solar, the sticker price, right? If I build agri PV, I have to have extra braces and extra supports to build it above so that I can grow the crops below, right? If I have rooftop solar, it costs more because now I have more labor. I have the father inside of their truck that I have to go climb up the roof and install it, as opposed to utility scale where it's right? So this is where, again, I think it's really important we start looking at the true cost. If the utility scale is 2.5, now with storage, it's more like, let's say 4.5. You add transmission, it's more like 5.5. Whereas distributed solar is 3.5. Again, you add storage, that brings it up to 5.5. But now you don't have the transmission costs. So it actually is basically the same cost of utility scale. So you need to start seeing DISCOMs see this as, look at the true cost of distributed generation versus the true cost of utility scale. But I'm simplifying the numbers a lot here. I concede it's not easy, right? Like there's a lot of factors to take into account, especially if your distribution feeder now gets overloaded, and now you have to have different protection controls and transformers, upgrades and things. So there's a lot of nuances to it. But you have places like California that have done this calculation, and usually what they show is that, yes, the cost of distributed generation is competitive with the cost of utility scale when you account for the cost of transmission.
Alex, you have a newsletter, Climate Tech Startups in India, where you write about innovations and young firms in the renewable energy space. How do you see this innovation curve shaping up? And we're talking about two different roles. One is at the national level, one is at the startup level. So where or how does it tie up with the larger need for decarbonizing power supply at scale?
Yeah, so I'm super excited. I'm super bullish. I think what I always like to say is, put a 1% tax on fossil fuel imports. So India spends $200 billion a year on fossil fuel imports. Put a 1% tax, so $2 billion, and allocate that to clean tech startups. India will be a clean tech powerhouse. And I've met so many startups that have, gone so far and beyond the power sector. Let's say, Navalt Solar, for example, in the transport sector, companies, raising $50 million in the US can't even get a boat on the water. Navalt has electric solar boats on their water today, displacing diesel today. Huge innovation, has gotten basically no government support, has done it all on their own, on a purely economic basis. The amount of money the boat operator saves on diesel is paid for by it pays for the extra cost of the boat, right? Take some of that 1% tax, give a little bit to guys like these and see them grow. I see this in green hydrogen. I see this. We've got a company in our portfolio called Renewable, which is doing these reflectors. Again, they might use imported Chinese cells, but the module design is all made in India. So the actual value addition is all made in India. So the actual cell, which is 10% of the 10 to 20% of the total project value might be imported. But if you allow this company to thrive and grow, they've got these reflectors that basically improve the amount of solar production in the evening and morning, which is exactly when India is short power, right? So you get away with less storage. I'd love to see them deployed all over India, but I think also it's a huge chance for them to become a global powerhouse. I see folks doing all sorts of innovative stuff in electric vehicle financing, different battery chemistries. I just invested in a company called Mining Electric, which is doing iron air storage, which is kind of long duration. So if you really want to get rid of your coal and gas plants completely, you need more than 2, 4, 6 hour storage. You might need more like 12, 16 hour storage. I just see so many brilliant innovators in India building things on $1 million or $2 million, what folks in the US and Europe have done with $100 million or $200 million. So I think if we just have a little bit more support for startups, take a little bit of that money we spend on imported fossil fuels and redirect it towards climate tech. I see India becoming, the world climate tech powerhouse. I really, really see the potential. I see the talent. They just need a little bit of support.
That's really encouraging to hear. And I think as there is a pressure, India produces a lot of engineers, and as there's this AI pressure coming up, I think there might be some kind of channel where these engineering skills can be used for renewables, at least, if not for other climate action.
Absolutely. I mean, the cost of renewables to power AI data centers is so much cheaper than the cost of coal. In the US, you see people using gas because they have super cheap gas because of the fracking boom there. In India, it's very, very clear arc storage is the cheapest option. And now data centers need very, very high levels of reliability. And this is where, again, we see lots of great innovators in India. I mentioned Mining Electric, but also, folks working on fuel cells, electrolyzers, other forms of long duration of storage. there's lots and lots of options to kind of get rid of the diesel gensets and provide kind of firm 99.999% reliable power, which, just to be clear, coal cannot provide, right? That is why these data centers have to have these diesel gensets. So you can not only get cheaper power, you can get more reliable power using clean energy plus storage of a sufficient duration.
Thanks very much for explaining these things as simply. It's a very complex issue, and you've explained it fairly simply. Thanks very much for this, and hope to touch base with you soon and revisit this issue, because I think there's just so much happening in on a month-to-month, quarter-to-quarter basis on this. Yeah. So thanks very much for making
Well,
time.
thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk about these things. As I said, I've got a blog where I write about this. I go into much more exhaustive detail, but hopefully I've tried to explain it in ways that are understandable for your audience.
Newsletter and to your blog in the description below. Always makes for good reading. All right. See you. Thanks very much.
Cheers.
Bye.